The following episode can be viewed on the YouTube channel Bernie or Bust Television.
Good morning, USA, and welcome to another episode of the Bernie or Bust Show. We've got two kinds of truth today. One kind from Chris Hedges and the other from Boots Riley. Chris Hedges wrote a Truth Dig article called The New Rules of the Game, February 17th. The quadrennial political game of least worst, or how to scare the public to vote for presidential candidates who serve corporate power, comes this season with a new twist. Donald Trump, if he faces Pete Buttigieg, Joe Biden, Amy Klobuchar, or Michael Bloomberg, will continue to be an amalgamation of Adolf Hitler, Al Capone, and the Antichrist. But should Bernie Sanders manage to evade the snares, traps, and minefields laid for him by the Democratic Party elites, should he miraculously become the party's nominee, the game of least worst will radically change. All the terrifying demons that inhabit Trump will be instantly exorcised. But unlike in the biblical story of Jesus driving the demons into a herd of swine, they will be driven into the senator from Vermont. Trump will become the establishment's reluctant least worst option. Sanders will become a leper. The Democratic and Republican Party elites, joining forces as they did in the 1972 presidential election, will do to Sanders what they did to George McGovern, who lost in 49 of the 50 states. Wow, Chris, that sounds bleak. If you're listening on podcast, who do you think said the following quote? If Dems go on to nominate Sanders, the Russians will have to reconsider who to work for to best screw up the U.S. Sanders is just as polarizing as Trump, and he'll ruin our economy and doesn't care about our military. Former Goldman Sachs CEO Lloyd Blankfein, net worth $1.1 billion, tweeted, "If I'm Russian, I go with Sanders this time around." Oh, Lloyd. Blankfein, who calls for cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and who headed Goldman Sachs when it paid Hillary Clinton $675,000 for 3 speaking engagements in 2013, laid out the stance of the billionaire class that controls the Democratic Party. The New York Times reported that Mike Novogratz, a Goldman Sachs alumnus who runs the merchant bank Galaxy Digital, said Mr. Sanders' oppositional nature had prompted too many friends, billionaire friends, I assume, to say they would vote against him in November. And they hate Trump, he said. We already know who said the next quote. Nobody likes him. Nobody wants to work with him. He got nothing done. He was a career politician. It's all just baloney, and I feel so bad that people got sucked into it, Hillary Clinton says of Sanders in a forthcoming television documentary. The courtiers in the press, pathetically attempting to spin Sanders' New Hampshire win into a victory for the corporate-endorsed alternatives, are part of the firing squad. Running Sanders against Trump would be an act of insanity, read the headline in a piece by Jonathan Chait in New York Magazine. Chief crybaby. No party nomination, with the possible exception of Barry Goldwater in 1964, has put forth a presidential nominee with the level of downside risk exposure as a Sanders-led ticket would bring. To nominate Sanders would be insane, he wrote. David Frum, now a darling of the Democratic elites, like many other Republicans who morphed from George W. Bush supporters into critics of Trump, announced in The Atlantic that Bernie can't win. Sanders is a Marxist of the old school of dialectical materialism from the land that time forgot, Frum wrote. Class relations are foundational. Everything else is epiphenomenal. Yeah, Chris is making fun of the best crybabies out there. Here comes Jennifer Rubin. Jennifer Rubin declared in the Washington Post that a Sanders nomination would be a disaster for the Democrats. Sanders' campaign, like all primary campaigns, is a preview of the general election race, and if elected, the administration he would lead, Rubin wrote. A nominee who insists on personally attacking all doubters and the media might be a model for the Republican Party, but Democrats are not going to win with their own Donald Trump, especially one who has burned bridges and stirred resentment in his own party. Thomas Friedman, in a column supporting Bloomberg, the newest savior in the protean Democratic firmament, wrote of Sanders, On which planet in the Milky Way galaxy is an avowed socialist who wants to take away the private health care coverage of some 150 million Americans and replace it with a gigantic, untested Medicare for All program, which he'd also extend to illegal immigrants, going to defeat the Trump machine this year? It will cast Sanders as Che Guevara, and it won't even be that hard. It's going to be so fun watching all of these commentators eat their words. MSNBC commentator Chris Matthews, descending to the red baiting employed by Blankfein, said that if Castro and the Reds had won the Cold War, there would have been executions in Central Park, and I might have been one of the ones getting executed, and certain other people would be there cheering, okay? Okay, Chris. Despite the hyperventilating by corporate shills such as Matthews and Friedman, Sanders' democratic socialism is essentially that of a New Deal Democrat. His political views would be part of the mainstream in France or Germany, where democratic socialism is an accepted part of the political landscape and is routinely challenged as too accommodationist by communists and radical socialists. Sanders calls for an end to our foreign wars, a reduction of the military budget for Medicare for All, abolishing the death penalty, eliminating mandatory minimum sentences and private prisons, a return of Glass-Steagall, raising taxes on the wealthy, increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour, canceling student debt, eliminating the Electoral College, banning fracking, and breaking up agribusinesses. This does not qualify as a revolutionary agenda. Sanders, unlike many more radical socialists, does not propose nationalizing the banks and the fossil fuel and arms industries. He does not call for the criminal prosecution of the financial elites who trashed the global economy, or the politicians and generals who lied to launch preemptive wars, defined under international law as criminal wars of aggression, which have devastated much of the Middle East, resulted in hundreds of thousands of dead and millions of refugees and displaced people, and cost the nation between $5 trillion and $7 trillion. He does not call for worker ownership of factories and businesses. He does not promise to halt the government's wholesale surveillance of the public. He does not intend to punish corporations that have moved manufacturing overseas. Most importantly, he believes, as I do not, that the political system, including the Democratic Party, can be reformed from within. He does not support sustained mass civil disobedience to bring the system down, the only hope we have of halting the climate emergency that threatens to doom the human race. I disagree with you there, Chris, because he did talk about how the people of Puerto Rico waded into the streets to protest, and he has mentioned other kinds of protesting as well around the world, and he has talked about being organizer-in-chief. And I don't think that's just of labor movements. I think that's also of protesting. On the political spectrum, he is at best an enlightened moderate. The vicious attacks against him by the elites are an indication of how anemic and withered our politics have become. I'm willing to call Bernie a moderate, but I do think that he is serious about getting people to protest in order to fix things. The Democrats have once again offered us their pre-selected corporate candidates. We can vote for a candidate who serves oligarchic power, albeit with more decorum than Trump, or we can see Trump shoved down our throats. That is the choice. It exposes the least worst option as a con, a mechanism used repeatedly to buttress corporate power. The elites know they would be safe in the hands of a Hillary Clinton, a Barack Obama, or a John Kerry, but not a Bernie Sanders, which is a credit to Sanders. The surrender to the least worst mantra in presidential election after presidential election has neutered the demands of labor, along with those organizations and groups fighting poverty, mass incarceration, and police violence. The civil rights, women's rights, environment justice, and consumer rights movements, forced to back Democrats whose rhetoric is palatable but whose actions are inimical to their causes, get tossed overboard. Political leverage in election after election is surrendered without a fight. We are all made to kneel before the altar of the least worst. We get nothing in return. The least worst option has proved to be a recipe for steady decay. The Democrats, especially after Ralph Nader's 2000 presidential run, have erected numerous obstacles to block progressives inside and outside the party. They make ballot access difficult or impossible for people of color. They lock third-party candidates and often progressives in the Democratic Party, such as Dennis Kucinich, out of the presidential campaign debates. They turn campaigns into 2-year-long spectacles that cost billions of dollars. They use superdelegates to fix the nominating process. They employ scare tactics to co-opt those who would be the natural allies of third parties and progressive political movements. The repeated cowardice of the liberal class, which backs a Democratic Party that in Europe would be considered a far-right party, saw it squander its credibility. Its rhetoric proved empty. Its moral posturing was a farce. It fought for nothing. In assault after assault on the working class, it was complicit. If liberals, supposedly backers of parties and institutions that defend the interests of the working class, had abandoned the Democratic Party after President Bill Clinton pushed through the 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement, Trump would not be in the White House. Why didn't liberals walk out of the Democratic Party when Clinton and the Democratic Party leadership, including Biden, passed NAFTA? Why didn't they walk out when the Clinton administration gutted welfare? Why didn't they walk out when Clinton pushed through the 1999 Financial Services Modernization Act, which abolished the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act, designed to prevent the kind of banking crisis that trashed the global economy in 2008? Why didn't they walk out when year after year the Democratic Party funded and expanded our endless wars? Why didn't they walk out when the Democrats agreed to undercut due process and habeas corpus? Why didn't they walk out when the Democrats helped approve the warrantless wiretapping and monitoring of American citizens? Why didn't the liberals walk out when the party leadership refused to impose sanctions on Israel for its war crimes, enact serious environmental and healthcare reform, or regulate Wall Street? At what point will liberals say enough? At what point will they fight back? And I think the answer is pretty obvious. At no point. They have to be hijacked. They have to be brought to their knees. I don't think they'll ever surrender, Chris. By surrendering every election cycle to the least worst, liberals prove they have no breaking point. There never has been a line in the sand. They have stood for nothing. Bernie Sanders arose in 2016 as a political force because he, like Trump, acknowledged the bleak reality imposed on working men and women by the billionaire class. This reality, a reality ignored by the ruling elites, was spoken out loud. The elites were held accountable. The Democratic elite scrambled successfully to deny Sanders the 2016 nomination. The Republican elite squabbled among themselves and failed to prevent Trump from becoming the party nominee. The 2016 chessboard has reappeared, but this time in the Democratic Party primary. The Democratic hierarchy, as horrified by Sanders as the established Republican elites were by Trump, is flailing about trying to find a political savior to defeat the Red Menace. Their ineptitude, Sanders' primary asset, was displayed when they mangled the Iowa primary. They, like the Republican elites in 2016, are woefully disconnected from their constituency, attempting to persuade a public they betrayed and no longer understand. Joe Biden, long a stooge of corporate America, for example, is frantically attempting to paint himself as a champion of poor people of color after his defeats in the largely white states of Iowa and New Hampshire. The one-time vice president, however, was one of the driving forces behind the strategy to take back the law and order issue from Republicans. He and Bill Clinton orchestrated the doubling of the prison population, the militarization of the police, and mandatory minimum sentences, along with juvenile boot camps, drug courts, policing in schools, and the acceleration of the deportation of criminal aliens. During Biden's leadership in the Senate, where he served from 1973 until 2009, when he became Obama's vice president, the Congress approved 92 death-eligible crimes in an almost identical period. These democratic law and order policies landed like hammer blows on poor communities of color, inflicting untold misery and egregious acts of injustice. And now Biden, who pounded the nails into those he crucified, is desperately trying to present himself to his victims as their savior. It is a sad metaphor for the bankruptcy of the Democratic Party. Biden, however, is no longer the Democratic ruling elite's flavor of the month. This mantle has been passed to Bloomberg, once the Republican mayor of New York and a Rudy Giuliani ally whose indiscriminate stop and frisk harassment of mainly African Americans and Latinos was ruled unconstitutional. Bloomberg, whose net worth is estimated at $61.8 billion, said he is ready to spend $1 billion of his own money on his campaign that the New York Times has called a waterfall of cash. He has bought the loyalty of much of the ruling Democratic establishment. He spent, for example, $110 million in 2018 alone to support 24 candidates now in Congress. He is saturating the airwaves with commercials. He is lavishing high salaries and perks on his huge campaign staff. Sanders or anyone else defying the billionaire class cannot compete financially. The last desperate gasp of the Democratic Party establishment is to buy the election. Bloomberg is ready to oblige. After all, Bloomberg's money worked miracles in amassing allies to overturn New York City term limits so he could serve a third term as mayor. But will it work? Will the Democratic elites and Bloomberg be able to smother the Democratic primaries with so much money that Sanders is shut out? As with Republicans in 2016, the defining characteristic of the 2020 Democratic race has been the unwieldy size of the field, Matt Taibbi writes. The same identity crisis lurking under the Republican clown car afflicted this year's Democratic contest. Because neither donors nor party leaders nor pundits could figure out what they should be pretending to stand for, they couldn't coalesce around any one candidate. These constant mercurial shifts in momentum, it's Pete, it's Amy, paging Mike Bloomberg, have eroded the king-making power of the Democratic leadership. They are eating the party from within and seem poised to continue doing so. Well done, Matt. If Sanders gets the nomination, it will be due to the Keystone Cops ineptitude of the Democratic leadership, one that, as Taibbi points out, replicates the ineptitude of the Republican elites in 2016. But this time there will be a crucial difference. The ruling elites, once divided between Trump and Hillary Clinton, with most of the elites preferring Clinton, will be united against Sanders. They will back Trump as the least worst. The corporate media will turn its venom, now directed at Trump, towards Sanders. The Democratic Party's mask will come off. It will be open warfare between them and us. One thing mentioned on the Bernie or Bust show in previous episodes is that they will be calling Bernie a Russian asset soon. So if you didn't hear it here first, at least remember that it was said. The other point that Chris didn't make was that we are probably aiming for a brokered convention. That is probably Bloomberg's endgame. He's probably trying to make sure that it turns out to be a brokered convention, in which case they can easily give it to him if they want to. Here's a Pop Dust article by Dan K. Boots Riley drops major truth bombs in endorsement for Bernie Sanders. Boots Riley recognizes the need for radical direct action because without radical direct action, nobody will listen and nothing will change. If you're a follower of Chris Hedges, I think you'll understand why I put Boots Riley right after him. Boots Riley, the activist, rapper, writer, and director behind Sorry to Bother You, the most underrated movie of 2018, although that's to be expected from majority white mainstream media when it comes to a biting satire about code switching and capitalist enslavement of black people, has taken to Twitter with his endorsement of Bernie Sanders. In a phenomenal thread spanning 33 tweets, Riley lays out his reasoning behind supporting Sanders despite the fact that he has never previously voted for a presidential candidate. His words speak to the experiences of many of Sanders' supporters, especially circa 2016, and reflect the ideological core that sets leftists apart from liberals. I have never voted for a candidate in my life, but I will be voting for Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary. Riley's thread outlines his belief that in order to have actual democracy, we need to live in a world in which the people democratically control the wealth that we create with our labor. Riley recognizes the need for leftist activists or radicals to push us in that direction through direct action, because without direct action, nobody will listen. Riley traces movements that fall in this vein from the anti-Iraq war movement, whereby millions of people took to the streets but were ineffective in convincing anyone with the necessary power to stop the war, to the Occupy movement, which brought discussions of capitalism and the 1% into the mainstream public conscience, to Black Lives Matter, which spoke out against cops disregarding the lives of black people and ultimately proved that even communal anger rarely results in any action from those in power. We must have movements with teeth, Riley says, ones that are able to force the hands of power. To this end, Riley sees value in radical militant labor movements wherein workers organize to strike in solidarity and in large enough numbers to shut down business. Riley points to Wayfair furniture workers' successful strike to stop the company from working with ICE and 20,000 Google workers rolling work stoppage walkouts to force management into addressing issues including workplace sexual harassment. In a hyper-capitalist society, collective movements with the power to shut down industries by withholding labor might very well be the only way to ensure representation and effect change. Ultimately, Riley clarifies that he doesn't necessarily agree with Bernie on every single thing, but that Bernie is the only candidate propped up by a movement consisting of millions of actual working-class people who are actively banding together to engage in necessary class struggle. Which is sort of a rebuttal to Chris Matthews in his article. He thinks that Bernie is weak tea, but I think that Bernie could start something that the oligarchs can't put back into the bottle. Funnily enough, another Twitter user presumably read through Riley's entire thread and still said, "I like what you're saying here. Will you show up to vote for any of the other candidates if Bernie doesn't win the nomination?" To which Riley concisely responded, "Nope." So now you know another reason why I included Boots Riley. Nope. Many people, especially working class people who fall along various lines of intersectionality, do not feel represented in American politics. Donald Trump may be an especially rancid embodiment of the racism and corporate greed at America's political core, but we can't pretend that centrist Democrats have the best interest of working class people at heart either, even if their social policies are slightly better. And in that, Chris Matthews would agree. The truth is that most politicians on both sides of the aisle are bought out by corporate interests, lobbyists, and the uber-wealthy, or alternatively fall into the uber-wealthy class themselves, and they aim to use their vast wealth to buy their way into government positions. None of these politicians, with their corporate donors or billions of dollars, give two shits about people who work full-time and can barely afford rent and food. But that's the beauty of a grassroots movement like the one surrounding Bernie Sanders. His supporters aren't corporations and lobbyists. They're working class people who are sick and tired of not being represented in American government, not just by Trump, but by the entire two-party system. There's a reason that, despite Bernie Sanders leading all other Democratic candidates in support from non-white voters, not to mention overall support, mainstream corporate media has continued to bash him at every turn, while continually posting op-eds with headlines like, "It's time to give the elites a bigger say in choosing the president." They covered that on The Hill Rising. This is a real op-ed in the Washington Post. I don't know what to say. This particular author was trying to make a case for candidates like Barack Obama and Mitt Romney as opposed to Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And in the same breath, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. So you know where this is coming from. Don't get tricked into believing that having a common enemy in Trump automatically puts leftists and liberals on the same side. The liberals who support candidates like Biden, Buttigieg, and especially Bloomberg, insisting that everyone must be united to defeat Donald Trump in 2020, while parroting the racist, sexist Bernie bro myth to erase the women and POC who support Sanders in massive numbers, are the same breed of white moderate that Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. warned about. That also Malcolm X warned about with the smiling fox analogy. First, I must confess that over the last few years I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate, says Martin Luther King. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' councilor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, "I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action," who paternalistically feels he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. If that doesn't sound like Hillary Clinton, I don't know what does. Bloomberg's policies and politics are historically similar to Trump. The things he stands for are the same as Trump, says Boots Riley. Nobody is obligated to hold their nose and vote for a transphobic, racist, sexist like Mike Bloomberg, and doing so isn't such a far cry from all the Trump voters who claim to dislike the things Trump says but voted for him anyways. That's not to say people should go Bernie or bust. Now this... Okay, so here's the last paragraph that we don't agree with, but everything to this point has been right on. So failing to come to the correct conclusion is a problem, but I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So here we go. That's not to say people should go Bernie or bust. Nearly every other current candidate is a step up from Trump, and there's an inherent privilege to abstaining from an election when 2 Supreme Court seats are on the line. But if it comes down to trading one oligarch for another, the DNC should prepare for a lot of people staying home. So if we need direct action, this whole article is about direct action. Boots Riley is in favor of direct action. Now, labor strikes are probably going to become necessary. Protests, even guillotines and pitchforks may become necessary, especially in Milwaukee if it comes to that. But if we could solve it with Bernie or bust, why not? Why would we say, after all of those points lining up one after the other to make a wonderful case for Bernie or bust, why would the last paragraph be, but don't be Bernie or bust? I don't know where this comes from. It makes no sense to me. Bernie or bust is the right answer to this question. Enough is enough. Bernie or bust. Enough is enough. Bernie or bust. Enough is enough. Bernie or bust. Let's get this straight, people. Let's get this word out. Bernie or bust is the right answer, and we don't have much time to scare everyone else into understanding. Friends, don't let friends vote for Mike Bloomberg in the primary elections and caucuses.
Get on board the Bernie or bust train. Come get on board the Bernie or bust train. Once you hear that clickety-clack, there ain't no time for turning back. Go get on board the Bernie or bust train.
The preceding episode can be viewed on the YouTube channel Bernie or Bust Television.